Omri. They want to make sure you know which Ahab here. Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Now, 29 is explained this way. You have a divided kingdom now after Solomon. The kingdom split, the 12 tribes split. You have the kingdom of Judah in the south. You can see it on your map, west of the Salt Sea down there, the Dead Sea, Salt Sea. That's the kingdom of Judah. You have 2 tribes in the kingdom of Judah. Judah, which is the largest tribe, and then Benjamin went along with them. So the nation is split. The other 10 tribes went up north, and you can see the word Israel spread across the Jordan River horizontally. That's the northern kingdom. If you ever read about the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, what they mean is north is the kingdom of Israel, 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom is the kingdom of Judah, 2 tribes. That means you have 2 kings and you have 2 capitals. Jerusalem, as you can see down by the H of Judah, is the capital of the kingdom of Judah. They maintain Jerusalem. They actually, in the Old Testament, the kingdom of Judah, in a general sense, fared better than the northern kingdom spiritually. They weren't perfect, but they in a general way did better. The kingdom of Israel up north, let's see. The kingdom of Israel up north had the capital of Samaria. You see the I-S in Israel. Look just south of the S. Samaria. That's the city of Samaria. That's where Ahab's palace was. That's where his capital was. Samaria is a city, but it's also a region. And that center region, it's not labeled here, but that center region, in a general sense, is also called the region of Samaria. And when Jesus said at one point, I must needs pass through Samaria, it means if you go from the north up by the Sea of, well, it's Chinnereth, but it'll be Galilee later, Sea of Galilee. If you're going to go from the Sea of Galilee, travel down through the Canaan land, down to Jerusalem, you're going to pass through the area of Samaria. Now, Ahab had his capital in Samaria, but if you look up north of the S, you find the little town of Jezreel. You see that? You go north of Samaria, you come to Dothan, Beth Hagen, keep going north, Jezreel. All right? He had his royal residence in Jezreel. I mean, these kings lived lavishly. The palace in Samaria was fantastic. In fact, he even built what they called the Ivory House, which is really just ivory overlay. But when they excavated it, they found in a storeroom over 200 ivory images that would have decorated the rooms. Over 200 of them. And so if you were king of Israel or king of Judah and you wanted to splurge, who's going to say no? And they built fantastic residences. I was intrigued in Unger's Bible Dictionary. If you look up Ahab, it's got a picture of the steps of his palace, which are still there. You can see a picture of it. That's why I can never get through Unger's book, because I'm on my way somewhere. Oh, look at that picture. Oh, look at that picture. I can never get through that book to where I need to be, because I'm stopping to look at all the photos. They have excavated Ahab's palace steps, which I think are in Samaria. I think it's the Samaritan steps, the palace. So when you read verse 29, and it says that Asa is king of Judah, and Ahab is king of Israel, now you know what that means. The nation got angry with each other. There was a lot of jealousy after Solomon left the throne, and the final straw was taxation. Solomon had levied significant taxation. The people were struggling under it, and they said now to the new king, are you going to relieve it? He said, no, I'm going to double it. And so, well, we're out of here. So they split over taxes. So you've got 2 kingdoms there. Now, the first problem with Ahab, and I've already put him down here, we have to take his wife with him because they are cohorts in crime, and you can't do one without the other. The first problem with Ahab is, it said that in verse 30, he did evil more than anybody before him. None of the kings as bad as he. So the first thing you have is a man that is not thinking of Jehovah. He's not considering what God would want done with his nation. He's just doing whatever he feels like he ought to do. And one of the reasons is, in verse 31, it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam. In other words, his conscience didn't bother him. It had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. Now this, I mean, it has to grieve the Lord at his heart that the king of Israel, not Judah, but Israel, would actually worship and serve Baal, the god of the Zidonians. Look on your map, and you'll see up at the northern coast, you see where Tyre is on the coast up north, way up north. There's Tyre on the coast of the Great Sea. The word Sidonians, sometimes spelled with a Z, Zidonians here, he married the king's daughter. And the Sidonians were not worshipers of Jehovah. They were heathen, and he married the daughter. So we have some lessons before us tonight. That first of all, I don't know if she's good looking or not. I don't know why he would marry her. Maybe it was. Sometimes you get married in those days because of your political career. I suppose that still happens today, but I think it's idiotic. But there are convenience marriages, you know. He married her, but she's of the Zidonians, and she's not a worshiper of Jehovah. So the king worships the way she sees fit. Well, we know Ahab is weak constitutionally, and she's strong, and so she's going to get her way. In fact, she was so dedicated that he built a temple to Baal in the capital of Samaria. He built a temple to Baal, and he built a grove to Ashtoreth. A grove would be a series of trees that are carved up, kind of like totem poles, where you would go to worship the gods in the grove. That's what they called it. But of course, God's against that because you don't worship God with images. This is one of the beauties of worshiping the Lord, is you don't worship him with images, anything like. Now the Catholics do, but graven images are not a good idea. In fact, they're forbidden in the Ten Commandments. See? So he marries Jezebel. She's the king's daughter of the Sidonians. And so immediately she brings Baal worship into the capital of Israel. Ahab follows suit and worships Baal. Another lesson for us. I know there were faithful people among the people, but they're ruled by an evil king. Sometimes God lets that happen. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. Kings rise and fall at God's pleasure. So sometimes, and I know there's a purpose for Ahab being on the throne, that God allowed it. And sometimes you just have to take an inventory of what you believe, regardless of how the nation is going, and stand on what you believe, regardless of the ungodly king. I'm sure there were people in Israel praying that Ahab, not live long the king. But he was there until God was done with him. He was there a while. So you've got ungodly leadership. You've got a marriage between the king of Israel and a heathen princess, and you've got influence within the home of the heathen princess over the king of Israel and Samaria. A lot of lessons here for us. We should try to be the influence for good in our homes and in society, not let our friends dictate to us how we act, not be afraid to be righteous in front of others. I think Ahab was a little fearful of Jezebel to be righteous in front of her, and he succumbed. It was just easier to succumb. And so she actually supported, let me see, get the number right. She actually supported, according to Scripture, 450 prophets of Baal out of her own funds. She paid their salaries, right? 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Astarte, which is another heathen deity, a female goddess deity of the Zidonians. Okay. Phoenician worship. So you've got a lot of lessons here in the Old Testament. These things are written for our example, so we look at Ahab and say, you know, a man with no character and no principles, he'll marry who he wants, he'll suffer the consequences, the whole nation will suffer under him, and we have ungodly leadership at the top. You have to realize that the divided nation was not in the Lord's plan. It didn't surprise him when it happened, but it's not in the Lord's plan. He wanted Israel to be of one heart and one mind. And now they're divided, and now they, in fact, in the beginning, God said, you really don't want a king, do you? And they said, remember, we want a king like the other nations. He said, you won't like him. They said, no, but we're going to have it. Well, they've got it. All right. So Ahab is a wicked king. You got another personage, though, that shows up in chapter 18. Verse number 17. Well, let's look at verse number 1. Verse number 1, 18:1. Came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go, show thyself unto Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. It seems that when evil is afoot, God raises somebody up to represent him. In verse 17 of chapter 18, it came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said unto him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? 18, Elijah answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou, and thy father's house, in that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Baalim. Couple things here. Sometimes Christians are raised up at the worst time on purpose. It's easy to be a Christian when the nation is clamoring for righteousness. It's hard to be a Christian when the leadership at the top is so wicked, it says there's never been anybody this bad. And when Baal worship is on the inroad and Jehovah's Witness, or no, yes, Jehovah's worship is on the way out. Nobody home. That's when Elijah shows up. And God has him for this hour. And so I'm asking everyone tonight to take inventory that when the dark clouds of idolatry and wickedness and paganism begin to take over your land, that could be the very hour that we need to stand the most. And notice how Elijah answers him. Ahab thinks, boy, this is sounding familiar. Ahab thinks he's troubling Israel because he keeps preaching against what's happening. He's troubling Israel. Today, I hate to say it, but in some corners of this country, with the powers that be, we are the problem. We're troubling we are in the way of the progressive movement in our country. But what is Elijah's? Well, you know, we just have to coexist. No, what did he say in verse number 18? He answered, I've not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house. You've forsaken the commandments of the Lord. Thou hast followed Baalim. If he's going to be God's messenger, he's going to have to give God's message and not acquiesce for the sake of peace. And so Elijah was a tough prophet who was going to give God's message. What did he do? He spoke truth to corrupt power. And you know, a king in that day could have your head that day if he wants it. But he spoke truth to power. And I have a feeling some of the chaplains that visit people in power in our country are more or less yes men, who don't go into the White House. And of course, every president has a chaplain or whoever, and sometimes you know who they are and sometimes you don't. But I dare say that we don't have an Elijah today that'll tell it like it is. But Ahab and Jezebel, worst king ever. He built an altar to Baal in the capital city of Israel, Samaria. And Elijah meets him on the command of God. He said, go show yourself unto Ahab. He rebukes Ahab. Now, we're not going to read the rest of the chapter, but the rest of the chapter is Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel calling down fire from heaven, you know, and they're dancing around and cutting themselves and all that. Elijah calls down fire. That happens in this chapter, see. When the nation seems to be turning away from God, Elijah takes a stand. And that's all we can do. That's all we can do. So that's a tremendous evidence of conviction and courage. We're going to have to figure our convictions out before the fire. You can't figure them out once the conflagration starts. You've got to know where you stand before. There's no time to think about it when the chips are down. You got to know right now, tonight, where you stand. And figure out that either God's worth it or he's not worth it. And that's what Elijah did. He knew he could trust him. All right. 1 Kings 21. Verse number 1. Came to pass after these things that Naboth, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Now, he says king of Samaria. He's the king of Israel, but he rules from Samaria. But he has another palace or a royal residence in Jezreel. You see where that city is again on your map, up north of Samaria. And one of the walls of his palace in Jezreel is the city wall. And we'll figure that out later too. And so right next to the palace, Naboth had a vineyard. Verse 2, Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house. And you know, he doesn't have enough. He doesn't have enough yet. It's never enough. It's near to my house, verse 2, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it, or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. And Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. He doesn't want to give it up. And there is a tradition, if not a biblical tradition, that you don't give up the inheritance of your fathers. And so I think Naboth's standing on pretty good ground. Verse 4, Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. Isn't it amazing? He's got an ivory house, he's got 2 palaces, and he's just pouting now because he can't have the vineyard of Naboth. And it said, because of the word, verse 4, which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him, for he said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid him down upon his bed, turned away his face, and would eat no bread. Kind of gives you a glimpse into the life of the man. See, there were dynasties in this day. You didn't earn the office. You were just next. Son of Omri. Omri was king. When he passed off the scene, well, his son takes over. That's what's wrong with a dynasty, is you're not necessarily qualified. You're not necessarily a good guy, but you're next. And I don't like that system. But anyway, he's king. Verse 5, but Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said unto him, why is thy spirit so sad that thou eatest no bread? Now, he knew, laying on the bed, facing the wall and not eating, she was going to ask. This is how he plays. She was going to ask. Verse number 6, he said unto her, because I spake unto Naboth the Jezreelite, and said unto him, give me thy vineyard for money, or else if it please thee, I will give thee another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give thee my vineyard. It's hard for me to read that with a straight voice. Jezebel his wife, verse 7, said unto him, dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let thine heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. Well, she is not a nice person, all right? So she begins to scheme And in verse 8, here's her scheme. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters unto the elders to the nobles that were in his city, dwelling with Naboth. And she wrote in the letters, saying, proclaim a fast, and set Naboth on high among the people, and set 2 men, sons of Belial. Make sure they're heathens. If they worship Jehovah, they probably won't do this. Make sure they're heathen enough to be wicked enough to lie about it. Sons of Belial, before him, verse 10, to bear witness against him, saying, thou didst blaspheme God and the king, and then carry him out and stone him that he may die. That's the plan. And the men of his city, even the elders and nobles that were the inhabitants of the city, did as Jezebel had sent unto them, and as it was written in the letters which she had sent unto them. So she found enough wicked people in the system to carry out this evil plan against Naboth, who had done nothing. Does that happen today? All the time. All the time. And I personally think in our very government, the higher you get in government, the less your life is worth. Because if you're in the way, we'll find a way. In fact, I'm not going to mention specifics, but it's happening right now again with somebody we all know. It's happening right now. And I've said in weeks gone by that SWAT teams show up at their house. True story. SWAT teams show up and take you out at 3 in the morning with CNN cameras rolling because they were tipped off to be there. And the guy did nothing wrong. He's been cleared since. But that's how they do. They try to ruin you financially. They'll tie you up with lawyers and court costs until you can't afford to fight it anymore because you're fighting the government. And they will, by hook or crook, get what they want. That's what Jezebel's doing. She said, you want his vineyard? I'll fix it so you can have it. She found enough, in verse number 11, she found enough wicked people in the city to be able to carry that out. Verse 12, they proclaimed a fast, set Naboth on high among the people. There came in 2 men, children of Belial, sat before him, and the men of Belial witnessed against him, even against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth did blaspheme God and the king. Then they carried him forth out of the city, stoned him with stones that he died. But notice who they send the message to say that it's been done. Did she not write the letters in Ahab's name? Did she not seal the letters with his signet ring, as if Ahab wrote the letters? But in verse 14, they sent to Jezebel saying, Naboth is stoned and is dead. They knew it was a fraud from the start. They knew it was Jezebel doing the scheming, and they knew those letters weren't from Ahab. They knew it wasn't his signet. It was his signet, but that she had forged his signet upon the document. Because when the deed was done, they said, let Jezebel know it's done. They knew who the mastermind of this was. So, Naboth dies. Verse 14, they sent to Jezebel saying, Naboth is stoned and is dead. Verse 16, it came to pass when Ahab heard that Naboth, this is the conscience of this man. When Ahab heard, 16, that Naboth was dead, Ahab rose up to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. I want to walk through my new vineyard. No soul, no conscience at all. So sometimes those people rise to the top. But somebody meets him in the vineyard. 17, I love this, but the word of the Lord and the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, arise, go down to meet Ahab. All right, the one preacher he doesn't want to see. The one preacher who won't say yes, sir, every time he has an idea, right? So Ahab meets him in the vineyard. Verse 18, arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, which is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, whither he is gone down to possess it. Thou shalt speak unto him, saying, thus saith the Lord, hast thou killed and also taken possession? And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, thus saith the Lord, in the place Where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine. Ahab said to Elijah, hast thou found me, O mine enemy? They meet up. Can you imagine Naboth strolling through the vineyard? He's so thrilled that it's his. Because you can't say no to the king, especially a guy like Ahab. He's pouting. He's got all this riches and power, but he wants the vineyard, and if he can't have it, he's going to pout on his bed. Now he's all happy because Naboth is dead. He goes down to see the vineyard. He's walking through the vineyard. His heart, his appetite has been satisfied. He's walking through the vineyard. He turns, and there's the preacher. What does the preacher say? Thus saith the Lord. What does Ahab say? Hast thou found me, O mine enemy? To the wicked, every preacher of God's word is the enemy. To the wicked, God is the enemy, and his representatives are in the way, and they are his enemy. What language here in the text that he had found it. Let's talk about covetousness just for a minute. Because you know the scriptures are against it. Covetousness is merely a strong desire for something. And there is a good covetousness. Some people are surprised by that. If I covet to do the Lord's will, that's a good thing. That simply means I have a strong desire to have the Lord's will in my life. A strong desire to have something. If I covet knowledge of the scriptures, oh God, I covet knowledge. I covet to have the mind of Christ in your word. That's a good thing. I want to have something, but it's a good thing. But if you covet on the other side, like Ahab did, he coveted Naboth's vineyard. Do you think a person would actually covet something enough to steal to get it? Yeah. That's why God mentions it so often in Scripture, that we're not to be covetous, because the heart of man, once it's set on something, it tends to throw down the barriers of decency to get it. People will steal. People will murder to get something. People will lie to get it. They'll lie about somebody else and harm someone else's reputation to get it. If I covet the wrong thing, I'm liable to go outside of human decency to get it, because if my heart is set on that thing, that's why God said in his word not to be covetous, because it's all kinds of trouble. Now we're sitting here tonight, we're looking at Ahab and Jezebel, and you say, well, that was a horrible thing they did. For what? For a vineyard, and he wants it for a garden of herbs, and they killed a man over that. They lied about it. They set him up. They unjustly killed him. Yeah, but it happens all the time. People that covet today, who have a heart that is with a strong desire set on something bad, that thing will eat at them until they will walk over you to get it. Happens all the time. So let's guard our heart. Let's watch ourselves. Let's be satisfied with what the Lord gives us. Paul said, I've learned at whatever state I'm in, therein to be content, therewith to be content. I know how to abound. I know how to be abased. He was content wherever God had him. He didn't covet somebody else's vineyard, somebody else's property, somebody else's wife. He knew better than, oh, there's one. You get covetous over somebody else's spouse. You know the homes that are wrecked over that because they couldn't tell themselves no. The heart is deceitful, desperately wicked. Who can know it? If that heart gets set on somebody else's spouse or somebody else's money or somebody else's car or somebody else's position, people cut in the business world, people will cut the throats of good people higher up to get into their office. Happens all the time. Happens a lot. So that's what we see here. We would say to ourselves, well, covetousness seems to be a minor sin. Well, yeah, but it leads to other sins. These bad people coveted something, and it got Naboth killed. Elijah meets him in the vineyard. You can't even have a moment, huh, Ahab? You can't even have a moment, and here comes the pastor. Hast thou found me, O mine enemy? Verse 20. And he answered, I have found thee, because thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. That's not a White House chaplain. That's a man out of God's own heart telling the king the truth. Now here's verse 21. Watch this. Behold, I will bring evil upon thee, will take away thy posterity. In other words, no more of your family on the throne. And will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall. That's the males, that's all that means, is the male population done. And him that is shut up and left in Israel. I will make thine house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, for the provocation wherewith thou hast provoked me to anger, made Israel to sin. So he walks up to the king and says, you have provoked God to anger and caused Israel to sin. And the male posterity on the throne of Israel in your house is done. 23. And of Jezebel also spake the Lord, saying, the dog shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. The thing about this is, in verses 27 through 29, Ahab actually repents. Look at 27. Now, I know you don't expect this. It came to pass, when Ahab heard these words, he rent his clothes, put sackcloth upon his flesh, and fasted, and lay in sackcloth, and went softly. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, seest thou how Ahab humbleth himself before me? Because he humbleth himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days will I bring the evil upon his house. So God saw that Ahab's repentance was genuine, said, I'm going to delay the problem. But the problem will still come. Well, first of all, we have to look at the death of Ahab. We're not going to do it with extensive reading, but in chapter 22, verse number 34, Ahab is in battle with Jehoshaphat. That's a whole other sermon. Ahab's in a chariot. He's in the midst of battle. 34, chapter 22. A certain man drew a bow at a venture. You know what that means? He wasn't even aiming. He just shot an arrow up into the sky. Yeehaw! And smote the king of Israel between the joints of the harness, which means he had some protective armor on, and that arrow just went up, unguided, just went up and came down right between the plates and struck, not any soldier, Ahab, in the midst of the battlefield. Wherefore, verse 34, he said unto the driver of his chariot, turn thine hand, carry me out of the host, for I am wounded. Well, the short of it is this, that he died that day. The blood was all in the chariot. And in verse 38, it says, one washed the chariot in the pool of Samaria. The dogs licked up his blood. They washed his armor according to the word of the Lord which he spoke. So the dogs came and licked his blood out of the chariot like Elijah said they would. So the dogs licked his blood because the dogs licked Naboth's blood, and Ahab was going to be paid back. Jezebel still lives. And if you look at the timing in the Thompson Bible, because every chapter has a date in front of it in the Thompson. That's Ussher's method of measuring time in the Old Testament. And it's 13 years later. Jezebel lives on for 13 years. I've heard a preacher say as many as 20, 25 years, but I don't know where he gets that. According to the Thompson method of dating, 13 years later. 2 Kings 9. Verse number 30.
Verse 30 or 13?
30. And when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it. She painted her face and tired her head, which means she put some type of headdress on her head. She tired her head and looked out at the window. And as Jehu entered in at the gate, she said, had Zimri peace who slew his master? In other words, she knows he's coming for vengeance. And she's warning him, there is no peace if you slay me. See? "32, he lifted up his face to the window and said, who is on my side? Who? And there looked out to him 2 or 3 eunuchs. We're probably sick of her. Anyway. 33, and he said, throw her down. So he says, the wall of the palace is the city wall on that side. Okay? Throw her down, verse 33. So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trode her underfoot. And when he was come in, he did eat and drink, and said, go see now this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. And they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than the skull, and the feet, and the palms of her hands. R.G. Lee's got a great sermon on this where he mentions those 3 items and goes eloquently into those. 36, wherefore they came again and told him, he said, this is the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, in the portion of Jezreel shall dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel. So she was trampled under the hooves of the horses, and then by the time he said, go bury her, the dogs had eaten everything but the skull and the hands. This is the word of the Lord. 37, the carcass of Jezebel shall be as dung upon the face of the field in the portion of Jezreel, so that they shall not say, this is Jezebel. Just like the word of the Lord said. So, notorious? Yeah. Ahab and Jezebel. For some reason, the Lord allows wicked leadership to rise to the top sometimes. Maybe for our example. Maybe for the example of Israel, the northern kingdom. Maybe Israel was being chastised for something at this point in their career. But you have to talk about it, Ahab and Jezebel in light of Elijah, and God always comes out on top at the end. Any questions? Any comment?
When you read about the sons of Belial and their accusation of Naboth, it struck me that they said he had spoken against God and the king, when it just said they were obvious heathens. So when you're talking about today's temperament of they have no problem bringing up something and having false indignation about something they don't even care about, they don't believe in.
Yep.
It means nothing to them, it's a means to an end.
Right.
I mean, they obviously don't care if he spurns God or says something against God. And today they bring up things that they
Yep.
don't really honestly care about the outcome. It's just about the means to an end.
It's feigned outrage because they're not really outraged, but the charges against Naboth were tools to be used to get him dead. And today we have feigned outrage all over the place, that when certain people do that, oh, I just can't believe it, the hate speech, the this, the that, they're not outraged, because in the next breath, they're hating on everybody. But it's a tool to be used to damage one side or the other. You're exactly right. They have no conscience about it. They're simply maneuvering, political maneuvering. That's all it is. It's pretty sad. Wayne?
I noticed it. I mean, I've gotten all the way, managed to get all the way through Psalms finally, and it seemed to me, even all the way up to that point, no matter who was the king, they all started out, okay, but they all always ended up on the wrong end of the stick. You know.
If you go through the kings of the Old Testament, you'll find a lot of them did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they would do this and that, other gods, and they'd marry heathen women, and they would kowtow to the neighboring tribes and things. But then you'll find, and he did right in the sight of the Lord, and then, but the next one did evil. See? So just because you got a good one now doesn't mean you're going to have a good one later. And they seem to go up and down a lot. There's a lot of bad kings in Israel. Not so many in Judah, but they weren't perfect either. Israel was the worst. Yeah. Good, Wayne. Somebody else? Yes, Bob.
All the kings, or a lot of the kings were measured, their wickedness was measured against Ahab.
Yeah.
They walked in the ways of Ahab, or he was, I forget the phrase, but he did worse than Ahab, basically. But they all measured against Ahab.
That's a good point. And some of the good kings, they were measured against David. They said he did good like David, or he did bad like Ahab.
Wasn't Jezebel really worse than Ahab, though?
Who thinks Jezebel was worse than Ahab?
I see him as kind of.
Who thinks it was a draw at the wire?
Ahab just knew how to get what he wanted through her. He just didn't want to do it himself.
He knew if he pouted.
Yeah, he knew exactly what would happen. He just didn't want to do it himself, so
That's
her
right.
hands were dirty.
That's right. But
Yeah, but she was willing, she didn't care.
Ah,
She
sure.
was like, I don't, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but he was at least like, well, I don't wanna get my hands, I don't wanna actually do anything to him, so I'll let her do it. Because she obviously would go that further step.
Well, then he was just weak and manipulative, because he still get his way. He just didn't want to get his hands dirty.
so who's worse?
I think it's a
I
tie.
say-
Yeah, because when Elijah meets him, hast thou killed and taken possession?
Yes,
He
but
lays
did
it in-
Jezebel lay down in sackcloth and ashes and
No,
humble herself at any
no,
point?
she's putting on her. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I don't know what that was.
I read a book.
The mascara.
That's the drawbacks.
I don't do that anymore. I never did do that. I knew a guy that did, but I didn't. That's true, I didn't. But the Lord lays it at Ahab's feet because, like Bob said, he was manipulative, he knew what she would do, and he felt better if his hands weren't on it. Even if she wrote the letters in his name, sealed it with his ring and all of that, he still didn't do it, but he let her do it. So he didn't care for her either. He didn't love her. He used her, and she used him to gain power anyway. Yes.
Well, it's the same, kind of the same line of reasoning with Adam and Eve, is the man's responsible for the house. So he has the greater responsibility for the actions of his household.
The Lord came to Adam first.
Yeah, he did the same thing, I think, that Pilate did. He tried to distance himself from the dirty deed, but it didn't work.
The Old Testament is not pretty, either on the sin side of not just leadership, but a lot of people. You know, look where we've been, or on the Lord's side of retribution. It's not pretty, but I think the Old Testament is given to us in all of its gory glory, so that we learn from it, learn to fear God, learn to do what's right. We don't have to have another testament like that. That's the idea. And so I know all these lessons end on a down note, and you know everybody's kind of looking, and I don't blame you. But to go through this is to prevent a lot of stuff, and so that's the purpose of it. Anybody else? You're a great audience. We want to pray for Jane, who is on the mend. Her infection is gone, and the surgery's healing up. And she lives at Morning Star, you know, Bob Sarver's friend. And the only reason she's not here yet is she's still carrying an IV pole around. She hasn't eaten in like 60 days, 75 days, something like that. But she's on the mend, so that's good news. Bob, you want to tell us about your brother?
Well, I talked to him the guy before I came over here, and he is, you know, he takes steps forward, then he's back. He's back again now this week, going in the other direction than what he was.